Hello, everyone, and welcome to Criminal Investigations Taught Completely in an online format. This is Chapter 1, Part 4, which is pretty unusual. And for clarity's sake, I'm using the 11th edition. We just wrapped up on page 24 talking about computer-aided investigations, and I'm going to continue right at the bottom of page 24. So open up your textbooks and your notebook, and let's get going. So in the bottom of page 24, it says, the ability to share data across jurisdictional lines is one of the most valuable benefits computers provide to investigators. In addition, the Internet has become an invaluable tool for criminal investigators, offering hundreds of thousands of websites and databases to inform investigators. One such resource is Thomson Reuters Clear for Law Enforcement, established in 2008, which allows investigators to access numerous distinct public records databases in one central location, saving investigative time, enhancing the detection and analysis of crime patterns and trends, and helping connect the dots between incidents, individuals, locations more efficiently and effectively. Yeah, the advent of the Internet and computers have made it so much more possible for law enforcement agencies to share information with one another quickly and efficiently. It wasn't like that in the past. It wasn't like that. The New York City Police Department had a unit called the Intercity Correspondence Unit. And basically, it was a bunch of cops and detectives who would call other departments, call them on the telephone and tell them, we're looking for this guy, we're doing this, we're doing that. You could see how time-consuming and how problematic that could be when as opposed to sending out an electronic message that the whole department might receive, right? So let's flip the page, go to page 26. And here we have a crime map on page 26, right? And crime maps have also changed the game for law enforcement. Years ago, before you had computerized crime maps, before you had them, you had pin maps in precincts. And they were maps of the precinct, and a red pin in a certain location meant it was a robbery, and a blue pin meant it was a burglary, etc. And they were so, ineffectual, primarily because oftentimes the data wasn't kept up, or sometimes people would, use the push pins for something else. I mean, it was a terrible way to do things. And then all of a sudden in the 1980s, you have crime mapping come out, automated crime mapping on computers. And if you take a look in the text, you see first of all, you have the legend, right, which is in that yellow box. It tells you the key code, right? And then if you look at the map itself, you could see right away where the busy places are in this crime precinct, right? And it's where you see that red and that yellow, the green to a lesser extent, right? But crime mapping allows for police departments to understand geographically where their resources might be needed. So let's take a look at the bottom of 26. It says, before the computer revolution, it says the traditional crime map consisted of a large representation of a jurisdiction glued onto a bulletin board with colored pins stuck into it. The map suffered from many limitations. Yeah, we just said that, right? But now crime mapping changes the focus, and I'm reading right from the text, page 26. Crime mapping changes the focus from the criminal to the location, the hotspots where most crimes occur, right? And then if you go down, skip a paragraph, they talk about GIS systems, right? Geographic Information Systems, which is what a crime mapping software is, right? And I'm going to introduce the term geoprofiling. So let's take a look. It says geographic information systems and geographic profiling are other powerful tools for investigators, right? And what does it mean? Well, first of all, geoprofiling is based on the theory that all of us have kind of a pattern to our lives. We drive the same way to school, or we drive the same way to work. We walk into the same door. We park in the same parking lot, right? We hang out in the same places. We go to the same stores all the time, right? Over and over again. And that's your geo profile, right? Your geographic profile. And so crime maps tend to give us an understanding of geography and how it relates to police resources. If you're a boss in the police department and you come in and you realize that one of your sectors, that's a piece of your precinct, is very, very busy, well, you're more likely to put more resources there, right? Absolutely. And that's what I used to use it for all the time. When I was a lieutenant on patrol and a captain, I would take a look at the crime maps, the computer-assisted ones, and I would assign my resources based on that. On page 27, we have the term data mining. We already talked about it. It says to be effective, investigators must know how to sift through mountains of available information to find the data that pertains to their case, a process known as data mining, right? And then going over on the right-hand side of 27, it says investigative. Well, they talk about problem-oriented policing, first of all, on 27, right? And that's really like community policing. In other words, what's community policing? Well, I describe community policing as, in partnership with the community, the police and the community identify and try to solve problems in the community, right? Because you need the community to help you identify the problem, and you often need to talk to them about the potential solutions, and they need to talk to you. So that's community policing. Let's go over to that page 27 where it says investigative liaisons. It says investigators do not work in a vacuum, but rely heavily on assistance from numerous other individuals and agencies. Liaisons that work well, within a community policing paradigm. Harkening back to 1829 in England, when Sir Robert Peel stated, "The police are the public and the public are the police," today's philosophy of community policing embraces the belief that by working together, the police and the community can accomplish what neither can accomplish alone. Okay, so let's stop for a second. Robert Peel, 1829. He says the police are the public and the public are the police. One of the most famous quotes in the study of policing. What did he mean? Well, he meant that they are one and the same. That the police come from the general public, that they serve them. They often live in that city or that state or that municipality, right? And that they are hand in hand in solving and identifying and solving problems in those communities. Who was Robert Peel? Well, he was a politician. He was a law enforcement guy. And in 1829, he takes credit. He's very successful in having a law passed in England. This is important, called the Metropolitan Police Act, right? 1829. The Metropolitan Police Act creates the London Police Department, right? You know, you've seen them on TV. They're called the Bobbies. And guess why they're called the Bobbies? They're called the Bobbies after Sir Robert Peel, right? So it says in the bottom of page 27, right above the blue box, it says community policing is not a program, but an overarching philosophy that promotes organizational strategies. Of course, right? Community policing really came of age when, around the same time that 1982, I believe it was, when George Kelling and James Q. Wilson wrote an article in a magazine, and the name of the article was Broken Windows. And Broken Windows basically said that police officers go into a neighborhood, they should take care of the small crimes. In other words, don't ignore the small crimes, because by ignoring the small crimes, you invite larger crimes to happen. So take care of the small crimes, and you may prevent large crimes. So that Broken Windows philosophy, which you hear thrown around a lot today. By the way, a lot of people say it's the best thing in the world. Other people are not so sure, just so you know that. But that Broken Windows philosophy, many police departments said, well, the way to do that is we have to be in the community. And so community policing was born in the early 80s in the United States. And the idea was really put cops into the community. Cops on steady beats, get to know the people, get to build relationships, get to exchange information, get to work together. That was the philosophy. Before that, the philosophy was different cop, different post, every day, not getting to know anyone. You're here today, you're there tomorrow. And they realized that the cops were not forging any relationships with the community. So community policing was an attempt to make cops forge friendships and relationships within the community that were mutually beneficial to the police and the community. The next part of the text kind of gives us a general understanding of what role everybody plays. So they start on the bottom of 27 with a discussion of uniform patrol, and we've talked about uniform patrol being the backbone of police work. They talk about the dispatchers and how important they are on page 28 and how much you rely on them when you're in law enforcement to give you accurate and timely information when you're going to a serious job, right? They talk about the prosecutor's staff, right? The prosecutors who you work closely with when you're in law enforcement because that's how you bring cases. They talk about defense counsel. And I'm going to read right from the text on page 28. It says, our legal system is based on the adversary system, the accuser against the accused. Yeah, that's what the adversary system is. It's the prosecution and the defense figuratively putting on boxing gloves, presenting each of their cases to the jury, and whoever the jury believes most is going to win. That's the adversary system, right? In many countries around the globe, they don't have the adversarial system. They have what's called the inquisitorial system. And that means in court, the judge wants to get to the truth. So the judge will ask questions, the judge will question witnesses and suspects. That doesn't happen in the United States of America. In the United States, we have an adversarial system. The judge is there to rule on matters of law and to make sure that the lawyers behave within the rules. That's what the judges are there for. They're not there to find the truth. Don't say what, because a lot of people don't really know that. In the United States of America, the judges they're referees. In other countries where they have the inquisitorial system, the judges are there to determine the truth. Big difference. And by the way, there's a term I'd like you to know right now. The term is discovery. Discovery. What is that? That's when a criminal case is going to trial. That's when the prosecution and the defense exchange their investigative findings. What does that mean? Well, basically, if I'm a detective working on a case and we're going to go to trial, basically the defense gets a full photocopy of my folder, my investigative folder. So there are no surprises. Right? You know how on TV you always see the surprises, the courtroom surprises? In real life, they don't exist too often because of discovery. And that means before both sides walk in, they know what the other side has, right? That's discovery. On page 29, they talk about corrections personnel. What a great job, great career, tough job, tough career, but so needed and so necessary to have good people in it. And I have a super lot of respect for correction officers, by the way. In the United States, we have over 2.2 million people incarcerated, more than we have ever had in our nation's history. And thanks to our corrections personnel, local, state, federal, military corrections, thanks to them, they're keeping watch over all of these people, right? It says on top of page 29, investigators may find it beneficial to have good working rapport with community corrections personnel because often people who are suspected of crimes have had prior run-ins with the law and may be on parole or probation from previous crimes. Yeah, of course. I worked many cases in my lifetime on the New York City Police Department where I worked closely with city and state corrections officers, closely. And then there's a conversation of recidivism and recidivism rate, right? It says another study, this is like the last sentence before those 6 bullet points on page 29. It says another study that tracked more than 400,000 prisoners released from 30 states in 2005 found about 2/3, 67.8% of all released prisoners were arrested for a new crime within 3 years. Nearly 3/4 were arrested within 5 years. I want you to take a look at all those stats, but the first one is super important because that's what we call the recidivism rate. The recidivism rate. The recidivism rate is the rate at which people leave the incarcerated life and then return to it within a few years. So in the U.S., roughly, every time we release 10 prisoners, 6 or 7 will be back within 3 years because the recidivism rate runs between 60 and 70%. It's really a bad commentary, I think, on the way we do things in general in terms of reintegrating prisoners. But that's actually another topic of discussion for my corrections class. But, when we release 10 people and 6 or 7 are going to come back within 3 years, we could probably be doing better than that. You know what I mean? But read all those stats. They're very interesting. Then on page 29, there's a conversation about physicians, coroners, and medical examiners. Let's take a look at the third paragraph. The first thing you should get is that a medical examiner and a coroner are not the same. It says in the third paragraph, the coroner or medical examiner is called if the victim has died. Coroners and medical examiners have the authority to investigate deaths to determine whether they were natural, accidental, or the result of the criminal act. Remember this, a medical examiner, is a doctor. A medical examiner is a doctor. A coroner is not necessarily a doctor, but yet they have the power to investigate and call upon professionals to investigate deaths. See? So if you go to some places that are small, they may have a coroner. It could be a funeral home director. It could be. But when you use the term medical examiner, you're generally talking about a forensic pathologist, someone who's a doctor. All right, let's flip the page 30, right? And this is forensic crime laboratories. Remember this, large cities often have their own forensic crime laboratories. New York has its own, New York City has its own, but states do, obviously. The FBI does, yes. But large cities, New York, Chicago, Miami, Philadelphia, LA, the list goes on and on across the country. Large cities tend to have them too. So let's look at the page 30. It says the state crime laboratory is usually located in the state's largest city or in the state capital and can be used by all police agencies of the state. True. The FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. is also available to all federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies with personnel available to provide forensic examinations, tech support, expert witness testimony, and training. Yes, absolutely true, right? And then they talk about in the next paragraph backlogs of cases in labs. What are they talking about? They're talking about the fact that in the United States of America, there are hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million, and that's what the text tells us, cases of evidence that are at any given time are backlogged, are not being processed. Why? Because they don't have, the laboratories, the crime labs, don't have the people or the physical resources, meaning the lab space, et cetera, to process all of them. They're usually extremely inundated with drug cases, right? So the drugs go to the top of the list because, as I said to you earlier when we were talking about field tests, you can't convict someone on a field test, so you need a lab exam. So drug cases usually go to the top of the list with sensationalized cases like murders. But in the United States of America, there are probably hundreds of thousands of rape kits, right? DNA kits taken from rape victims that sit untested because they're in that backlog. By the way, rape kits are also referred to as Vitullo kits, Vitullo, named after Dr. Vitullo, who developed the kit. But there are hundreds of thousands of them sitting in boxes, untested, and that's a tragedy because that means so many of those rapists won't get caught and those cases won't get solved because the evidence is sitting on a shelf somewhere. And that's because of the backlog, and that's because there's not enough resources to process them. Let's go down to citizens. It says witnesses to a crime should be contacted immediately. Of course, you want to keep them in the game. You don't want to lose your witnesses because if you do, you're going to have an unsolved case. And that's, witnesses who are citizens, obviously, on page 30, right? And don't forget, we interview witnesses, we interrogate suspects. And then they talk about victims on page 31. It says almost every crime has a victim. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, also known as the NCVS, U.S. residents aged 12 or older experience an estimated 6 million violent victimizations and nearly 17 million property victimizations in 2013. Remember, there's about 320 million people in the United States. About 160-70 million of them are adults. But so NCVS says altogether about 23 million crime victims over the age of 12. That's pretty large, right? So remember that. And we'll talk later more about the NCVS and the UCR certainly, and NIBRIS. We'll talk more about that. Go over to major case task forces. This is when agencies either get their own people together to work on a case or multiple agencies come together. Now, listen to the distinction. When I was a young detective in the Central Robbery Division in New York, the NYPD put together a multidisciplinary task force, and it included central robbery detectives, burglary team detectives, sex crimes unit detectives, and the precinct generalist detectives in one unit to investigate a rapist/burglar who was committing crimes in the city. I was on that task force, right? That type of task force, all different specialists and generalists from the same agency, that's called a multidisciplinary task force or a multidisciplinary approach. What's different from that is what we call a multi-jurisdictional approach or a multi-jurisdictional task force. Multi-jurisdictional means law enforcement people from different agencies come together to work on the same case. So, for example, I've worked on cases, and when I was in the New York City Police Department, I've worked on cases with the FBI, the Secret Service, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, New York State Police, New York State Corrections, New York State Parole. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anybody, and I certainly am. And other police departments, right? Worked with Yonkers Police, worked with White Plains Police, Mount Vernon Police. These are all cities in Westchester County next to the Bronx, right? So a multi-jurisdictional approach to crime investigations means law enforcement officers from different agencies, different jurisdictions is the word we use, right? So the Orange County Drug Task Force, if any of you are familiar with it, right? And I hope if you are, it's from reading the papers. But what are they? Well, those are law enforcement cops made up from state police, Newburgh, Middletown, Cornwall, et cetera, et cetera. That's multi-jurisdictional. Make sure you understand the difference between multidisciplinary and multi-jurisdictional. Let's flip the page. I think we're coming close to the end. They talk about federal law enforcement resources on page 32. They mention the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. They mention the DEA. They mention Interpol, which people think really is a police agency. It's really not. It's really an information clearinghouse. You know, people don't run around with police shields and guns that say Interpol. That's more of a clearinghouse where all the agencies around the world send Interpol information so that Interpol can then send it back out to all the other agencies, right? And by the way, I just want to talk about on page 32, they talk about clearing a case. This is a super important concept that you're going to have to get because you're in this class. So in the United States of America, there are two ways to clear a case and two ways only. And what does it mean to clear it? It means it's a form of solving it, okay? So there's only two ways to clear a case. One, the arrest of any one person for the crime, no matter how many perpetrators are involved. So if you have 15 perpetrators and you arrest one guy, technically that case is cleared. So that's the first way. Arrest is cleared by arrest. Case is cleared by arrest. Any one perp arrested. The second way is what's called exceptional means. And to clear a case by exceptional means that you know the identity of the perpetrator, but for circumstances beyond law enforcement's control, that perpetrator cannot be brought to justice. So, for example, somebody does a homicide, and then 2 weeks later, before they're caught for that homicide, they get killed. That's an exceptional means or exceptional clearance, as we say also, because we know who it is, but we can't bring them to justice. Or a person does a serious crime and they flee to a country where we do not have an extradition treaty with them. We can't go out there and get them. We can't go to that country. That's a cleared case unless, of course, they come back to America. Then we open it up and we arrest them, right? So a cleared case by exceptional means infers we know exactly who did it. but we just can't bring him to trial. We can't bring him to justice for reasons beyond our control. If you can't find somebody, you've looked high and low and you can't find the perpetrator, that's not an exceptional clearance. So, for example, one time I was working a case and I was looking for a guy in a fatal shooting. And the case was old. It was probably like 6 or 7 months old when we finally got an ID on the guy, right? When we finally knew who he was. When we checked up on him, we found out that he had been sentenced to 20 to life in another homicide. So when I went to the DA and talked to her about what are we going to do with this case, she said, he's doing 25 or 20 to life? Yeah. And we'll take an exceptional clearance on it because we're not going to prosecute him on this if he's going to be in the joint for 20 years, if he's going to be incarcerated for 20 years. So make sure you understand that. If you don't get it, 2 ways to clear a case: by arrest and exceptional means. Make sure you get it. And take a look and read that in the textbook, right? Then they talk about investigative productivity. And there's basically 3 or 4 ways that we measure investigators how good they are. Number 1, what type of cases do they work on? Right? That's important in determining how good they are. Are they complicated cases or are they simple cases? Number 2, right? The number of cases they work on is number 1. How many, right? Number 2 is the type of cases, the complexity. Are they complex or are they simple? Number 3 is how many clearances do they have, right? How many cases have been cleared? Remember, there's only 2 ways to clear a case. And number 4, sometimes we even look at the conviction rate of investigators to determine how good they are. Because there are some investigators who might be great field investigators, but they always lose in court. That's a problem, right? And they usually, if they lose in court, it's probably because their paperwork stinks, their notes stink, they don't know how to testify. So that's a word about investigative productivity. You'll find that on page 33. Also, there's a conversation about civil liability on page 33. This is super important. Civil liability refers to your risk of being sued is your civil liability, right? Your risk of being sued. Police officers have a high civil liability. They have a high risk or a high likelihood of being sued. College professors, not so much, right? And take a look at that second paragraph. And then the third paragraph, super important. It says, most civil suits brought against law enforcement are based on Statute 42 of the U.S. Code, Section 1983, also called the Civil Rights Act. What does that mean? That means when police officers deprive or correction officers deprive someone of their constitutional rights, when they deprive them, they are going to be sued pursuant to Statute 42, Section 1983 of the U.S. Code, that they deprived that person of their civil rights. Flip the page to page 34, and they talk about cognitive biases, organizational traps, and probability errors. Make sure you take a look at that. It's basically the ways that criminal cases get messed up. That's what it is. Where the mistakes are likely to happen. And lastly, the chapter wraps up with a discussion of exculpatory evidence. We already talked about it. We talked about inculpatory and exculpatory evidence. And so you should take a look at that as well. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. So there were 4 parts for chapter 1. It's pretty unusual. I usually do 3, 2 or 3 actually. So that's it. Remember, if you have any questions, you post them to the discussion boards, also known as the blogs. And remember, guys, you got to hit those required readings, do the blog post. It's worth 15% of your grade. Get your homework in. It's worth 15% of your grade. Take the exams within the allotted time. They're worth 70% of your grade. Make sure you do all that stuff, right? Because it's important. If you do that, if you treat this class with a level of energy and commitment, you're going to be fine. You're going to pass it, okay? So, as always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the blog.